Right, so I'm sure that the coffee have energized you so that you are full of energy for the next session, which is a very interesting session with the title of Sustainable Development Goals and Public Procurement. And we have two eminent speakers for this. First one to my left, which is Mark Hidson. Mark is the Global Director of ICLE's Sustainable Procurement Center, and I will leave to Mark to explain exactly what the ICLE stands for, but it's Local Governments for Sustainability. Mark is also the co-chair of the 10-year framework program on sustainable public procurement. He is the vice chair of the International Green Purchasing Network and a member of the European Commission's Green Public Procurement Member State Advisory Group. Mark has a degree in environmental science and a master in environmental management. And after his presentation, we will have the pleasure of listening to Farid Yaker, who is in charge of sustainable public procurement at the UN Environment Economy Division based in Paris. He is also the coordinator of the 10-year framework program on public procurement program, and oversees the implementation of 2 ground projects aimed at assisting 16 countries in the implementation of sustainable public procurement. Mr. Yaker holds a degree in agriculture economics from the University of California in the States. Yes. So, without further ado, I'm pleased to invite Mark to take the stage.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the organisers for the invitation to speak. So yes, the topic is Sustainable Development Goals and Public Procurement. A bigger topic than maybe you first imagine. Hopefully I can explain why. But first maybe I should explain who ICLE are. Essentially it's a local government network. We have around 1,500 members and partners worldwide, working on the topic of implementing sustainable development. So we have offices in each region of the world, and one of our key programs is sustainable procurement, or procurement, and we work on or focus on sustainability, innovation, circular procurement, and strategic procurement. It was really our local government members that recognized the potential for this back in 1998. So we've been working on the topic now for 21 years, and actually the work we do, or the majority of the work we do, is in Europe, and of course we work under the public procurement directives. So actually our work isn't just with local governments, we work with all public authorities. So that's national governments, universities, hospitals, as well as cities. So you've probably seen this slide many times before, I hope you have. It's the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, there are 17 of them and 169 targets. And this really sets a global framework for implementing sustainable development. That was the intention. It was developed by experts and stakeholders. ICLE was one of the stakeholders. Back in, before 2015, and 2015 they were launched. And this is quite an ambitious program, and it sets the agenda for not just national governments worldwide, but also for all different stakeholders. So whether that's public authorities or the private sector, for NGOs, civil societies, it really encompasses all of the stakeholders, and they were developed together with those stakeholders. So the strength of this framework lies in the fact that it is a global framework. So the idea is really to work together, not just with the stakeholders, but all the countries to work together to try and focus on sustainable development. The predecessor to this, of course, was the Millennium Development Goals, and there's some significant differences that I want to highlight between the SDGs and the MDGs. And the first one is, of course, about building awareness, but is more of a focus on actual sustainable products and services in this one. So that's quite key for sustainable procurement and public procurement. It's about sharing technology to spur innovation. That's highlighted much more in the SDGs than they were in the Millennium Development Goals. It's also allowing developing societies to adopt these technologies, recognize technologies on their own aren't going to solve the problem of achieving sustainable development. And of course, and I put this very bluntly, the biggest difference is not just about poor countries anymore. It's actually all of the countries of the world. So where does procurement feature? I mean, I guess you should be aware of this, but in case you're not, it's in number 12, which is responsible consumption and production. Yeah, it's fairly obvious. It should be there. I'll come into more details about where it features. But first of all, I really want to talk about why does procurement feature. I think this is important to know the background to this. Of course, this is a definition taken from, or used by Sustainable Procurement, taken from the UK government, who developed it back in 2006 as part of their procurement strategy. And that is, public organisations can meet their needs for goods, services and works and utilities in a way that achieves value for money on a whole life cycle basis. I'll come back to that. In terms of generating benefits not only for the organisation, but of course for the environment, society and economy. So that is why the people who developed the Sustainable Development Goals wanted to focus on public procurement. In essence, it is sustainable procurement to a certain extent, but of course it goes much wider than that. So the life cycle costing, this is really taking into account the purchase of a product, the use of the product, the disposal of a product. And that's quite key, I think, with the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly for developing countries, which should be encouraged to take this approach. Of course, it's not easy. So, again, some figures here. Public procurement is seen as a demand-side policy. So, in most regions of the world, there's a figure. In Europe, it's between, I think it's 14% and 16% of gross domestic product could be spent on through public procurement. So it could have a huge influence on the types of products and services that public authorities buy. And it's the same globally, according to the UN. Again, it's 10 trillion. I think in Europe it's 2 trillion. But 15% of global GDP. That's a huge amount of money that could be spent. And if that could be shifted towards more environmental products and services, more products and services that benefit society and the economy, it can have a huge impact. And actually it was recognized also by the UN Intergovernmental Committee on Sustainable Development that there is just not enough money to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. They said here there's a multi-trillion-dollar yearly funding gap to implement that. So why develop a framework that you then really can't implement because there isn't the funding? Well, they recognize that public procurement is a way of doing that, based on the fact that 15% of the GDP can go on sustainable products and services. So this is also why they brought it in as a mechanism. They recognize shouldn't just also be highlighted as a tool to implement. It's also, there's a lot of money there that can help implement the Sustainable Development Goals as a whole. So what else, why else has it become at the fore in the past few years? And this is in general, not just for the Sustainable Development Goals. But society, I think, has recognized that the way we're using resources is not sustainable. It's also recognition that what we purchase impacts on the environment and society. Climate change has been a big issue in that sense, and people are starting to recognize, well, we're having quite a detrimental impact on the environment. How do we get around this? Well, we look at the products and services we're buying. We look at the amount of pollution we're producing. Businesses, that's quite key, and that's also one of the big differences between the Millennium Development Goals and the SDGs, is that business has been brought to the fore. They've been recognized as quite important in implementing the goals. And the recognition is that they've come up with new business models. I'll give you a simple example. 10 years ago, we used to buy just photocopiers. But we used to buy them from companies, suppliers. We would have them for 5, 7 years maybe, and then dispose of them. But the model has changed now, and this has really been driven by the private sector. They recognise, well, it shouldn't just be a photocopier, it should be a multifunctional device to do many different things. But also, we're not going to sell it to you, we're going to lease it to you. And you think, well, what's the benefit? Leasing is maybe cheaper than selling it. But then there's the advantage that they can then maintain. They have a service contract. They can maintain the photocopier. So they've then got a guarantee for that 5 to 7 years income by maintaining it. And of course, the more efficient a photocopier is, the less they have to maintain it. So the cheaper it is for them to do it. Of course, then they can then take it back. Most of the multifunctional devices that we can take back are still usable in some way, or can be broken down and the parts can be reused. So again, they've got another business model there that they can then sell it on or reprocess it. So they recognise its business models. Very simple, but this can also be applied on a much larger scale, such as the Sustainable Development Goals. The public sector, of course, recognition that the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, is a key policy element of what they're doing already. But public procurement can be used to achieve these. Also can be more cost efficient. Particularly, I think somebody mentioned earlier about the 2008 recession. This is again where public procurement came to the fore. There's a recognition that we need to spend more money wisely, or in sustainable procurement's case, don't buy products or services you don't need and be cost efficient. So these are other key reasons as well. Well, they chose procurement, the stakeholders involved push procurement because it sends a message out there that particularly from the public authority side, that this is important. The way we spend money is important. As I mentioned, it helps governments tackle key challenges of society, not just climate change, an aging population, air pollution in a particular city. These are quite key for political representatives. They've got key challenges, digitalization, smart cities. Well, how do you tackle all these? There's so many they're struggling. But public procurement is a mechanism to look at these challenges and to get what you're asking for. Cost efficient, I've mentioned, but improve the efficiency and effectiveness of public services. It's also recognised, and this is particular in Sustainable Development Goals, that it can create jobs, can provide jobs, particularly through new technology, innovative technology, but of course, as long as it's sustainable. It also can support small businesses, local suppliers, and this is a big issue across the globe, not just for developing countries, but developed countries as well, particularly from the public authority side. Cities, hospitals, schools want to use local providers. That's an issue in itself in Europe, which I won't address yet. It drives the market for innovation. It's a demand side, so it's not just about sustainability. You can actually do innovation procurement. It addresses social inequality. Well, you've heard quite a lot this morning about that. It's quite a key aspect of it. And it's actually, I think procurement is not used as much as it should, particularly for gender equality. So it was good to see those presentations. And it can empower specific groups in society as well. So back to where does it feature? Yep, I hope most of you knew 12.7. Promote public procurement practices that are sustainable in accordance with the national policies and priorities. Indicator 12.7.1, the number of countries implementing SPP policies and actions. And Farid and I worked over several weeks to try and find a better way of putting that for this indicator, but we just could not find one. So you think that it's pretty generic, could be much better, I would agree. But we couldn't find a better way of monitoring it. So that's the indicator that we feel in today that we can monitor and actually get some useful information. So that's why they're quite generic. But still, it's about setting in motion that public procurement is important. So the fact that it's in there, I'm quite happy about that, and I guess Farid is as well. So specifically under 12, these are some of the targets. As I say, 17 goals, 169 targets. These are some where, procurement isn't particularly recognised, isn't highlighted, but procurement can have a key role. The first one, achieving sustainable management and efficient use of natural resources. Well, that's what sustainable procurement is about, as I showed in the definition. Global food waste. at the retail and consumer level, and also down the supply chain. Well, again, procurement can have a huge impact on catering services. Public authorities buy a lot of catering. The health services, the national health services, of course, buy a lot of food. It's achieving environmentally sound management of chemicals and all waste through their life cycle. Well, cleaning products, for example, if you take Europe, for example, is a key issue with hazardous substances. So cleaning services is a key aspect of procurement. In developing countries, it's about the production processes, particularly people using hazardous chemicals while they're putting products together. Procurement can address that. Even from Europe, procurement can address that, but of course it can be addressed itself at the national level in many countries. 12.5 is substantially reduce waste generation through the prevention, reduction, recycling and reuse. Well, if you take circular procurement, it's about closing the loop. So again, it addresses the disposal phase of procurement. So where else does it feature? Goal number 3, it's about ensuring healthy lives and promote well-being for all ages. Of course, these are some examples. I mean, you could list all of the targets, and I'm pretty sure procurement could have a role. But I've pulled out a couple that are a bit more specific and more closely related to procurement. And here is to reduce the number of deaths and illnesses from hazardous chemicals and air and water and soil pollution and contamination. Of course, this is not just about the cleaning services, which is what the picture is there. It was written to be much broader than that, because in developing countries there's a real issue about, well, not in just developing countries, in all countries of the world, pollution is a key issue. Air pollution is a key issue. But procurement can have a key role. We're talking about air pollution in Europe. In a city, well, you can tackle maybe through public transport or mobility. You can set criteria for purchasing energy-efficient or energy-efficient buses, or purchasing local renewables, green electricity. And there it is. That's one of the goals: ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern energy for all. Wow, that's what purchasing green electricity is about. And that's the target: increase substantially the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix. It's a key one for procurement. Goal 8, you could list pretty much all of them in Goal 8, I think. Promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work for all. Yeah, procurement. I won't read these out, it's a bit of a heavy slide, but I think you get the general impression. Maybe I'll just focus on the tackling child labour. That's a key issue, I think, that can be done through procurement. And in the past, particularly in Europe, it's been unsure whether you can do it. Well, it can be done. I think even when it was the 2004 directives, it could be addressed. And particularly now, it is highlighted in the 2014 directives. It can be done. I'll come back to that and how it can be done a little bit. So how can it impact in practice? Well, it's all well saying, yes, procurement can tackle all those SDGs, but well, how do you do it? Of course, that could be a separate presentation in itself to go through the different stages, but I'll maybe give a bit of an overview about how it can be done, or how it's currently being done. So this is the majority of approaches, I would say, still, and also in Europe. You buy a product, you use it, there's usage costs, people maybe take into account that. They meet the general regulations, or not always the case, but try and meet the general regulations. And of course, then they dispose of it, again, trying to meet the regulations. And you can say, right, I've ticked the box, I've done green or sustainable public procurement, therefore I'm doing my job. Well, it's a good starting point, but it's, I think, much more. Procurement has the potential to address much more than that. And this is how I see it, that it can be addressed. So, if you got here, the public authority, as I've just mentioned, looking at use and maintenance is quite key for them. But a tender put out by public authority can have an impact on the whole supply chain and also how it's disposed of. So let's take raw materials and material processing. What I've just said, you can address whether child labour is involved in how a product is being produced, how raw materials are being got from the ground, from mining, for example. You can address this through public procurement. The materials processing, how products are put together, again, can be addressed. The delivery even. I mean, for example, transport is being delivered by transport. You can say you want that to be reduced by 20% the CO2. You can actually put the figure in. And then I've mentioned the use maintenance, quite key. But you've got the whole repair, reuse, material recovery phase, which is definitely underused. And this is generally taken from the circular procurement guide, but it shouldn't just be circular procurement. You can recycle the product. You can put criteria into a tender. You can put it into the award. You can put it into the contract clauses discussed earlier, those different stages. You can do that also for the disposal phase and say you want it to be recycled. You want it collected or separated. Example of the photocopiers. Furniture is a good example of that. And I think it's quite important to recognize that for a procurer to do this, it needs to be recognized as a profession. It very much focuses at the moment on it's seen as an administrative function. Make sure that the process is done properly of procurement. Make sure you're ticking the box that you've met the legislation, and that's it. But it has to change. And that, I think, is only going to be done through professionalisation. And I'll come back to that. So what are the barriers to using procurement to achieve sustainable development goals? Well, this is in general for also achieving sustainable procurement or good procurement. It's the legal and policy framework. In Europe, there is a better framework, I think, to look at these SDGs and to help implement them. But actually in developing countries, it is much more difficult. Basically because a lot of the countries that we're working with around the world, they say that it's just about lowest price. Any criteria that's put in there is seen as that it won't get the lowest price product or service. Or it's even seen that corruption is an issue. I've heard that before, that the use of sustainable procurement increases corruption, even though I have no evidence of that. But it's perceived to increase that, which is a key issue in many of the developing countries in particular, but also in some countries in Europe. It's about the market barriers. Again, this is probably a bit more than just a perception, but a lot of it is perception, that if you put out a procurement tender, that people are worried that the products and services don't exist. Well, there are ways of getting around doing that, maybe doing market engagement, talking to suppliers, but of course the corruption issue comes in again there. But you can put that, and I actually think it can make it more open and transparent if you follow the process correctly. And I think it's essential to do market intelligence, do research, find out what products and services are available. If they're not available in your country, are they available in that region? Budgetary constraints, that's definitely perception that using procurement to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, the first feedback we got is that that's going to cost more. And it doesn't cost more. There's evidence out there, there's a number of studies out there to show that it doesn't. Maybe an initial cost, particularly if you're looking at maybe purchasing energy efficient equipment, but actually in the long term, and this is the life cycle costing, it's actually cheaper in the longer run. But when you take into cost, even if a product or service costs more, the impact on the health, the impact on the environment, the impact on society for a lot of developing countries is greater. Well, same in Europe as well. So therefore, taking it into account at the national policy level, down to the public authorities putting out procurement is essential in the longer term, if you take a longer term view. And that's what the Sustainable Development Goals are looking at by 2030. Capacity issues, of course, lack of training, lack of guidance, lack of tools, lack of understanding, lack of methodologies. I think not in Europe, certainly, not in America, not in some of the more developed countries, but in a developing country, maybe. But also, I think probably the culture is an issue. So some key questions. So as I say, I think in Europe, there's a framework there already set to help implement the SDGs. That's come about, not just because of the SDGs, it was there before, but how do we overcome that barrier in developing countries? How can we increase the commitment of governments towards the value of procurement? Well, I'm hoping, particularly the students of the master's course, you are going to be the ones that are going to tackle that. Well, some of you maybe, going to be tackling those questions in the future. We're looking at it now, and we're working with probably such a small percentage of cities. We work with around 300 cities worldwide on this topic at the moment. That's such a small percentage. Some of them are leads, some of them are just starting out, and it needs to be much more than that. My view is that you should make, let's call it sustainable procurement, it's actually just good procurement. you should make sustainable procurement mandatory. And of course, when I say that, the UN, the Commission, I think many lawyers probably think, well, what are you talking about there? How do you make it mandatory? Well, of course, you can't just have a target and say, right, we want 100% SBP, because what does that mean? How do you develop it? How do you measure it? Well, what you can do is that you can set targets for different product and service groups, or for different aspects, well, like gender equality, but I think that should be covered by national legislation as well as procurement, and it is in many countries. But you can set it by products or services. In the EU, they started to look at that through the Clean Vehicles Directive, which looks at transport, where they take into account the CO2, the life cycle costing, how energy efficient the vehicle is. So they've broken it down to a specific product or service group. That can be done in other products and service groups as well. The majority of procurement that they're asking for in Sustainable Development Goals is going to be voluntary. The Sustainable Development Goals are also voluntary, of course. But I think to achieve something through procurement, we have to move to the mandatory phase. But it's also a lot more than that. I think legislation has to change, particularly in the developing countries. And that's about the culture aspect. I think we have to change this perception that it costs more, that it is going to increase corruption, there will be less transparency. It doesn't. That's not such an issue. And there are studies in Europe, in other countries, in South America, I think in Australia, where this is shown, this is not the issue. And it has to be put at the top level, which is something we're doing or trying to do with the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable public procurement that Farad and I both co-lead on. And it does need to come from that level. It needs to filter down. But it is also about training. It is also about raising awareness. It's about piloting good practice examples. And I use the word piloting specifically because the Deputy Mayor of Helsinki we work closely with set a 100% SPP target for the city of Helsinki. He's no idea how he was going to measure it, but he wanted to send a message. But he said, if we support him, if we get it wrong twice, he will be out of a job. So what we did is we said, okay, well, let's say we're piloting. Let's say you're going to be an advanced city. You want to test. That's what people want. They want to see that you're trying to tackle societal issues. Sell it like that. Don't sell it to sustainable procurement. So we did test it. It did work, fortunately, most times. But it never came up that this was a risky issue, because procurement is also, or sustainable procurement, is seen as a risk issue. So we were able to get around that. And in some of the countries, in the developing countries, we're working in Africa, we're trying to do that approach by piloting it. There are many other ways. That's just some of the ones I highlighted. So I want to talk a bit about the pros and cons of Sustainable Development Goals. I must admit I was a bit sceptical at the start when they developed this process. I still am a bit sceptical, but saying that, it's got some positives. And I'll start off with the cons first of all, because I want to end up on a positive note. But the cons that there is, for example, regions, particularly Europe, already have a framework. So if you've got 17 Sustainable Development Goals, 169 targets, and you ask a city that's struggling with resources, personnel capacity, to now go and develop a plan to implement 169 targets and measure them, I mean, it's just not going to happen. Well, some cities are taking it up, but in the majority of cases, it's just not going to happen, I don't think. It helps maybe politically to say, well, it's on the agenda, so it can give you arguments, the strategy's already there, but there's not going to be a thorough process to develop 169 targets, I don't feel. In different regions of the world, I think it's a good starting point for that. If you don't have a basis, you don't have a sustainable development strategy, then start here. It's reaching the local level is difficult. That's the example I've just given. Perceived as being too abstract. Yes and no, actually. I've heard that quite a lot. I think originally when the SDGs came out, before the targets were set, I think there was some issue that this is very abstract. But actually, the fact that public procurement is in 12.7, I actually think, well, that's quite concrete as a target. Some of them are abstract, some of them aren't. But you're going to get that when you're looking at a global perspective. So the positive, it does raise awareness and reference worldwide. I mean, I'm pretty pleased that we got procurement in there to recognise the work that we're doing without as I say, the mandatory requirements, it's important to have this in processes like this. It also recognises procurement specifically as a mechanism to implement not just doing procurement for the sake of it, but also all the other sustainable development goals. Not so explicitly, but it recognises that it's sustainable consumption production is a key issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Very interesting. Farid, the floor is yours. And the microphone.
Good morning, everyone, especially the students. I think you're coming to really an end of a very, very intense period, and I commend your courage and dedication. I think your professors have always put the bar very high, but I think you've been able to follow, to really get always follow and learn and keep your dedication to your studies. So I'm really proud of what you're doing. So just give me another half an hour of attention. I know it's hard for you, you're kind of saturated, but please, bear with me. Mark already covered some points of course wanted to highlight, but I think it's when we say that raising awareness is about repeating. So I think repeating sometimes will be useful, some of the key messages. And what I will do is, in order to complement a little bit what he said, I will tell you about why we need to pursue sustainable procurement, the challenges and opportunities that lie in sustainable public procurement, and then I will present you some of the results of our latest global review on sustainable public procurement. This is the 2017. It was just printed last week. You can find it online. It's a collective work that we do with the 10-year framework program on sustainable public procurement, which is led by UN Environment, co-led by ICLEI and KT. And it's the second edition. The first one you can find is 2013. This one is 2017. So it's really a snapshot of where do we stand in terms of implementation of SPP at world level. Okay, Jack already introduced me, so no need to go into that. All right, some of the key reasons and why we need to engage to sustainable procurement. I think the belief that the major cause of the continued deterioration of the global environment was linked to unsustainable pattern of production and consumption is not new. It dates back already from Rio in 1992. Okay? And before that, of course, we had Stockholm, 1972, where the UN Environment Programme was established, right? It was the first major conference where we understood the need to have a collective action to address the environmental challenges of the planet. But then in 1992, we officialized the concept of sustainable development in Rio, which was introduced in 1987 by Gro Harlem Brundtland, Prime Minister, I think, of Norway. And you see that the topic of sustainable consumption and production that became Goal 12 that Mark presented was already there in Rio. And why is it so? It's so because all our consumption acts have impact on the state of resources, on pollution, or on social conditions. Just take the consumption of 2 cups of coffee a day. You know, we've been consuming largely that amount, you know, over these days. So this uses at least 5.5 kilograms of fertilizers. We need to use toxic pesticides. In many cases, we need to clear-cut forests to grow even more coffee because we are even more numerous in the planet. Just take paper, something that is very common. It takes 98 tons of resources to produce 1 ton of virgin paper. So every single purchase has hidden human health, environmental, and social impact. And what's important is that it's throughout the supply chain. And if you add to that today we're around 7 billion people, but in 2050 we will be over 9.5 billion people. So these are 9.5 billion consumers, you know, that have a footprint that will have an impact on our resources, on social conditions. And not only are we going to be 9.5 billion people, but we're going to have 1 to 3 additional middle-class consumers. You know, people that consume like Americans, like Europeans, with a very high impact on the resources, on consumption. And they're not just in developed countries, but most of them will come from emerging countries, what we call the BRICS, etc. China already today has 300 million of those consumers. We see them in Paris, you know, purchasing in Galeries Lafayette, you know, buying the fancy, fashionable items that we spoke about yesterday with Rola at Hermes and Gucci and Longchamp, etc. So, and they come with the plane, and of course they spend a lot. So every time you spend a lot, then you have to think that there is a whole supply chain upstream with impact, social and environmental. So the problem is that we already broke the balance with our carrying capacity of the planet. We are beyond the 1 planet level. And if we go on this path, we'll get soon to the 4 planet level. So this is really unsustainable. So we have to decouple. What does decouple mean? We have to keep quality of life growing. We have to keep economic growth growing, but we have to limit the use of nature. And this will come through modification of production techniques, production that are less resource intensive, and also change our lifestyles and modes of consumption. And that's where sustainable procurement can play a key role, because sustainable procurement is included in the modes of consumption. The objective being to come back to the balance, the equilibrium level, the balance level of 1 planet by 2040 or 2080, depending on the scenario we'll opt for. So where does sustainable procurement come from in this picture, or come into this picture? In the UN, we believe it's a huge opportunity to promote the 2030 development agenda, and this was highlighted and explained by Mark. I'm not going to get into the definition anymore that he presented, just to tell you that he presented some of the impact. Here you have a list, additional list of impacts that was produced by the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, which is an organization based in the US, one of the leading organizations in the topic, and look at how many impacts they have identified, either in environment, social, or economic domains. Additionally to what Mark said, and complementing him, what we find is that sustainable procurement cannot work in isolation. You cannot just do sustainable procurement and forget about the rest of the policy framework. It has to be integrated in an enabling policy framework. And we have to use all the instruments that exist, legal and political, at world level. And here I'm citing only a few. The Paris Agreement, too bad that the US withdrew and lessened a little bit the power of this agreement. But we have other successful ones, like the Montreal Protocol is one of the the pride of the UN, because we've been able, through this instrument, to really limit the depletion and reconstitute actually the ozone layer. We have other instruments on human rights. We have the ILO declarations. We have the OECD guidelines for companies, UN Global Compact, etc. All these instruments really are enabling ones to really promote sustainable procurement and make sure that we have more effective sustainable purchasing policies. Mark mentioned the EU. That's one of the best examples of where we can have a really coherent policy framework, and you see that this means that there are policies for sustainable development. The EU has a sustainable development strategy. It has a growth strategy. There are policies for sustainable production and consumption. They have an SCP action plan, sustainable consumption and production. They have an integrated product policy. And then they have sectoral policies. Mark mentioned the Clean Vehicles Directive, which really helps procure purchase vehicles, and it has some mandatory clauses there. So procurers, they don't have to really think how they do things. They have to abide by those directives, and then they have to purchase vehicles that are in line with the obligations of the directive. So this really helps sustainable procurement. You have the same things in terms of buildings, in terms of energy efficiency directive for electronic appliances. So this is really enabling and conducive to sustainable purchasing. And then you have specific law on procurement, and we saw that this had been really described and discussed previously. That's really helping also sustainable purchasing in the EU. All this then is transposed to countries. I'm sure that many of you come from EU countries, so you can check your legislation. You can find the same aspects in your national legislations that are also supportive of sustainable procurement. Some other challenges that we face. Mark mentioned the issue of life cycle costing. In our study, we found out that total cost of ownership is really being more and more used, and that's good news, because it will help us really give an advantage to resource-efficient products compared to products that have low initial acquisition price but maybe higher use cost and disposal cost. Typical example is lighting. You have many countries still where they buy incandescent lighting because they still use lowest price, right? But if they were to really apply the total cost of ownership, really they would switch very rapidly to LEDs. So now we're putting in place some conditions with financing, with dialogue with the market, with the manufacturer, to make sure that we can support governments in making the right choice in procuring these energy efficient goods. So that's one example. But beyond that, we have to move to really a new conception of value for money. And what do we mean by that? Is value that incorporates the externalities, right? That factors in the costs incurred by society as a whole, including negative externalities, for example, emission of CO2 and ozone depleting substances, impact of health, we said it, impact on health because of the pollution of cities. This is an increasing and really concern in many cities. So when we do procurement, we have to take this into account, because these are costs that you incur, was said before, in hospitals. These are real costs that the society has to pay in the end. And also positive externalities, the know-how, the technologies, etc. So how can we move from really a stricto sensus value for procuring entities to a value that is more real and that incorporates externalities? And then there is the side of what we pay. And here too, I think we can move on. We can make sure that we lower the price we pay for green goods, for example, by phasing out the subsidies to fossil fuels. We have $140 billion that are spent to support fossil fuels that are emitting CO2 instead of supporting renewables. So there is a major issue there. So we have to make sure that we have a level playing field that doesn't disadvantage green goods. Right? So we can use, of course, green taxations. We can increase volumes, of course. This helps also, making sure that we don't disadvantage SMEs. So that's an issue also. All this, will help us support also the procurement of sustainable goods. And we introduced this notion of life cycle costing in the ISO 2400. You know that there is a new norm, a new ISO standard on sustainable purchasing that has been published only 2 months ago. And you will find that the concept of life cycle costing is central there. And you will see that we're advocating moving from acquisition price to total cost of ownership to monetization of life cycle costs. And again, the EU Public Procurement Directive now allows us to do this. This is also new, even though it's quite difficult. By the way, we've been contacted recently by a researcher in Italy. Her name is Alessandra Zamani, and she's doing really a kind of survey of all life cycle costing processes and experiments that are happening with the public procuring entities. So she's doing that for CONSIP. So if you're interested, please contact me and I'll try to make you in touch with her. So increasing the value by making sure that we have the societal value, the environmental value, and not just the economic value. Then there's another issue. Mark had this nice diagram about supply chain. I think the next frontier is how we can work not only at the level of public procurement, but institutional purchasing. Because governments, they purchase from companies, but those companies purchase from other companies. And what we want to have is to have a green supply chain, from end consumption to the extraction of raw materials, etc. And we know that the impacts, the sustainability impacts, are along the supply chain. So our operations is really the tip of the iceberg. The real impacts lie in the supply chains, the things that you don't see. When you buy a phone, okay, you have the phone, but you don't know, that there's blood in this phone because it's linked to a conflict in Africa. Some of the inputs that you have in this phone. So it's a reality. So we have to make sure that the whole supply chain is green and sustainable. So not just public procurement, institutional. Just an example, the US, in terms of end consumption, the GDP part is $10.1 trillion. That's really a lot compared to household goods. So household, they buy for $2.4 trillion, but institutions, whether they be governments that buy for $2.4 trillion or private sector that purchases for $7.6 trillion, they are at the end of the consumption cycle. So they have they are uniquely positioned to demand transparency into the upstream and downstream impacts of goods and services. And also they are capable, what individual consumers cannot do, of incorporating sustainability criteria into purchasing decisions at a scale that can shift markets, that can transform markets towards sustainability. Other challenge, I'm not going to talk about it because it was covered by Mark, and Gustavo is really making sure, that there's no overlap whatsoever with my friend. We have to align, of course, our SPP policies with the 2030 development agenda, and this is happening, interestingly, already a lot in the private sector. We have here representative from EcoVadis, is Louis Stein here, is one of the leading rating agencies, and they are thinking about how they can incorporate 2030 agenda in their rating system. SPLC is looking also as how, when they do really the measurement, the metrics of sustainable procurement impact, how we can link that to sustainable development goals, i.e., you can tell a company, or a company can say in its report, we have contributed to jobs, we have contributed to climate, we have contributed to water efficiency, etc., and through our sustainable purchasing policy, and maybe tomorrow we'll be able to quantify these contributions. So 12.7, of course, it's key for us. We're working in UN Environment and the 10 YFP program on the measurement of, defining a methodology to measure this indicator, because as you can understand, number of countries implementing sustainable public procurement policies and action plans. How are we going to count those countries? Who will decide when this country is implementing, another one is not implementing? I mean, we're going to have really fights. We're going to have really, I think, big issues with countries that they will tell us, no, we are implementing, we believe we are implementing, because they want to show that they have the maximum number and the maximum grade or score, you know, in the SDG report. So we have to work and build a consensus around what does it mean to be implementing. So we're working on a maturity model to decide what is the cutoff point between countries that are implementing and are not yet implementing. And I will finish by offering you some of the results of our global review. First of all, just the framework. This is conducted, I mentioned it, in the framework of what we call the 10 YFP program, which is the major framework to support sustainable consumption and production that came out of the Rio +20 conference. And within this framework, we are leading the SPP program. The objective is really to work together to accelerate the shift to SPP. Two major objectives: build the case for SPP. We need to convince decision makers that it's a useful and effective tool, and then support implementation of SPP on the ground, directly helping all the implementing organization. First edition was in 2030, I mentioned. This one is the 2017. We had score sheets provided by 41 governments. So 41 governments really responded to the questionnaire, and we are going to issue very soon a new annexes to this with all the score sheets of the 41 governments. So it will be interesting because you will see, you know, where those countries stand in terms of implementation. What comes out is that the SPP policy framework is broken down between SPPs included in overarching or thematic policies, i.e. in environmental policies, in socio-economic policies, in sustainable development strategies. It is also included in procurement regulations, and it's in specific SP policies, for example, action plans and city plans for SPP. What types of sustainability issues are addressed by SPP policies? So most governments, they cover environmental and socio-economic issues. So it's really what we call sustainable public procurement and not green procurement, right? In 26% of the cases, they focus only on environmental issues. What categories? We have the usual suspects that you find all the time: IT, office paper and stationery, vehicles, cleaning. These are the low-hanging fruits, right? And of course, we have the high-impact ones like building, equipment, materials, etc., but they are more complex, so they come after those, I would say, easy categories. What are the activities that are undertaken when we do SPP? You wouldn't be surprised that, first of all, we try to define SPP criteria and guidelines. Training, we provide information, we integrate SPP in processes and procedures, we network and exchange, we integrate in software and tools, for example, e-procurement, reputational incentives, we engage with the market, we provide economic incentives. What are the trends in SPP? The drivers first for SPP, according to the survey participants, because besides the 41 governments, we interviewed also 200 experts to get their view on where is SPP headed. And they said that the strongest drivers, and you're not surprised by that, should be policy commitment. Mark mentioned mandatory SP rules. So we share this view. I mean, they share this view, and also strong legislation. And then we come training, expertise, availability of criteria, availability of the products, of course, personal commitment to sustainability by staff, and I should mention that we have evaluation procedures of staff also. Performance evaluation of staff is a key point. And then, of course, monitoring. What are the emerging topics? Eco-labels and standards and certifications are really at the top of the list. Then monitoring, climate change, of course, is important. Training, life cycle costing, we mentioned, e-procurement platform, transparency in supply chains, all that I already covered. The barriers, I'm not going to get into that. Mark covered that pretty well. Just to say that how we can address some of the barriers, we said that perception that products are too expensive. He mentioned life cycle costing, lack of expertise, of course, training, low market availability of sustainable products, stimulate the maturity of the market, and eco-labeling programs. And then the competing procurement priorities, and that's an issue, I think, for procurement systems, the need to professionalize procurement and to modernize procurement programs. The conclusion of the study, and I'm finishing by this. So the study really highlights how SPP is becoming a widespread practice. So that's a good news that now there's no question about the usefulness of SPP. Even organizations like the World Bank in 2013, they weren't really sure that this was the right option. Now, with the new procurement regulations, they have really accepted and made sustainable purchasing a central element of their procurement policy. So there's not question anymore. SPP activities are on the rise in all types of organizations, including local governments, not-profits, and private sector, both large and small, so it's really widespread. SPP requires a solid policy foundation, top-level leadership support, and excellence in implementation. However, considerable work needs to be done still yet before sustainability considerations become regular criteria within bid specifications and contract. And here, mandatory procurement, I think, will help. Some national governments are shifting their SPP policies towards now what they call the strategic procurement policies, which includes goals like innovation, for example. So sustainability becomes only one pillar of a more global strategic approach. It goes beyond picking greener products and encompasses activities at every step of the procurement cycle, and we've been discussing this also. SDGs and Target 12.7 provide an opportunity to formulate a more standard definition and articulation of SPP practices and measures that will help in measuring progress and will encourage its adoption. And then transforming sustainable production and consumption patterns will require collaboration among all stakeholders along the supply chain, the issue of supply chain again. And I would like to add one point, is that now with this new way of doing procurement, we cannot rely only on one procurer that is gifted or is trained on sustainability. We need to have teams that work together. We need to have procurers, requisitioners, we need to have legal experts, we need to have sustainability experts that all provide some of the knowledge to succeed in sustainable purchasing. To find out more about our program, this is the link, and to join this program, you're welcome, and we really would like to have you in this program, collaborative program. Thank you very much, and sorry to have been a bit long.
Thank you very much. Two excellent presentations. If I may, just add some personal reflections. Hugging the floor as a moderator, you have the opportunity to also hug the microphone, making sure that it stays with you. So I'll take the opportunity. Environmental issues is something which is very close to my heart. And I was sitting thinking, why is that? Part of that issue is obviously, is the fact that I am from Sweden, a country which is very, let's say, conscious about the environment. And I'm just thinking, why is that? It's not, in my opinion, the fact that it is a country which has a beautiful environment, because there are many countries which has extraordinarily beautiful environment. It's not based on that someone came up with a brilliant idea that we should look at environmental issues in our procurement procedures. There's something very different, I think. Yeah? And I'm thinking back to, let's say, I'm a child of the 60s, yeah? and during the 60s, what happened was that there was this man who eventually became known as Skrotkalle, which basically freely translated mean Carl with the rubbish. And basically what he did in the very early 60s was that he got so fed up with seeing all these cars and tires and rubbish being dumped around the roadsides, etc. So he took upon himself, on his own initiative, he bought himself an old, this kind of car which you can pick up rubbish with, especially cars. You put them with heavy machinery up on the back of this truck, and took upon himself to take away these cars. And this became a very big story in the early 60s in the papers. He got a lot of attention, radio, TV, etc. And part of what happens in a socialist environment, which Sweden is, it's a very collective type of approach to things, and I think that very clearly this idea of your own initiative to help out with the environment became very important during the 60s, and it was translated into that schools started to organize that there were once every year the school day when every kid had to go out and pick up rubbish in their neighboring area. Scouts, we had twice a year. We went out in the forest and picked the rubbish, and this is something that was ingrained very quickly into the society, that you were expected to do these kind of things. Now, why am I saying that? Because I think it's very important, this aspect of that you can legislate and you can put into procurement policies, etc., but it also has to come from the people themselves, that this is actually in your mindset, that you really, really take care about your environment. I think that is very important, and I think one part of this should be, when we talk about the environment, how do we make sure that our kids are continuing this work? Because obviously it's not like we can now start to work only on kids and wait 40 years until they put it in the public procurement regulations, But point being, I think these things need to work very much hand in hand to get it into the mindset of people, and you can only do that when you are kids, I think. I also went to, just as an example, I went to a conference which was organized by the Swedish Embassy in London, and it was a discussion between the mayor of London at that time and the mayor of Stockholm at that time. And one thing I took away from that, which I, as a Swede, thought was, this is quite funny, was that the question was, let's say the thing was that the mayor of London had a long speech about how proud London was to have reduced the number of landfills from, I can't remember exactly what it was, but let's say 25 down to 10 or 15 or whatever it was. And this was obviously a very good development, but it was also, from a Swedish perspective, quite nice to hear then when the mayor of Stockholm came to the stage and said, well, we haven't had a landfill around Stockholm for 20 years. So, point being, this was already in every aspect of society was making sure that at the end of the day the waste was being used basically to 95%. So, sorry for hugging the microphone for a while. It was just my my personal reflections. Now I'm going to open up for any questions from the floor. Let's see. I have the usual suspects here. Do we have any other? Yes. Do you mind if we start from the back there? Yeah.
Thank you. Georgi Lomtadze from IDFI, NGO in Georgia. Georgia is currently implementing the 16th goal, mostly focusing on the 16th goal. But in general, it's a good idea to have public procurement involved in the Sustainable Development Goals. But I have a question. Has there been any experience of practically putting public procurement or certain aspects of public procurement, for example, some requirements within tender documentation or some benchmarking for the action plans themselves? Once we have the Sustainable Development Goals, we have then the plan, the action plan with benchmarks and what we want to reduce or what we want to get. And has there been any good experience in actually putting public procurement in practice and in use in a sense? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's hundreds of good practice cases out there. A good source is actually to go to the European Commission website. We manage the Commission's Green Public Procurement Help Desk, and there's around 160 good practice cases. All of them, I would say, could be linked to the SDGs in some way. Whether there's any specific case studies related to the SDGs, I'm not aware of any yet. There may be a couple developed through the 10-year framework of programs, but we haven't got to that stage yet because I don't think you need to do that. Unless you're introducing a guide about what the SDGs are related to procurement, then you have some good practice cases and then you would relate to which SDG is done. But most of the case studies out there, and we've written hundreds, if not thousands, each one could be related to a specific SDG. The list of points I put on there about where procurement was relevant to the targets, yeah, there are many in each of those, many case studies.
Yeah, I mean, you have to understand that SDGs are really new. September 2015, it's yesterday, you know. So now organizations, I think leading organizations are just starting to think how they can map, you know, sustainable procurement impact to the SDGs. And I was in the conference of the SPLC in Denver in May, and this subject was just starting to emerge. You know? So there is awareness, you know, that we have to make this link, but how we do it is not yet there. I mean, as Mark said, we have to really map all the impacts to different targets, right? And so we have to have a framework. We have to have tools that are in place to help procuring entities do this connection and then maybe report on the achievement of certain SDGs through their policies.
Thank you. Yeah. Not working? Can
you stand up?
Yeah.
Yeah, or I speak
yes,
in the
very
mic?
Good. Yeah, thank you.
My name is Anna Shebessa from Wageningen University, so we're a quite green university and we're very interested in these kind of topics. And I would suggest that one problem in the actual implementation through public procurement is actually in the concept. So sustainability has the three different facets, at least, of social and environmental. And if you look at actually concrete products, these can clash with each other. So for example, and maybe you could comment also on this process, in the formulation of the green public procurement criteria that's currently undergoing by the European Commission, you have the formulation also for green public procurement criteria for food. So in the case of food, you have these, this initiative started by DG Environment, which means that at the moment the definition is limited to environmental concerns, leaving out social considerations first. And second, one way of checking whether food is actually good or not would be through labels. And then you have actual legal problems of referring to labels such as MSC or ASC for seafood or fair trade. Yes, I think there is a competition concern where you would formulate government procurement criteria that rely on a specific label, while if you don't rely on a label, it becomes very hard for a procuring authority to check the quality of a food product, for instance, and which criteria they actually use, whether it's dolphin-friendly or really a green-blue food. If you could comment just on this process.
Yeah, I can certainly comment on those. I'll take the first one, the differentiation between green, social. Unfortunately, at the European level, that is an issue, something that we've been pushing the Commission to tackle for a long time. I mean, it's partly because actually it's in different DGs. As you rightly said, green public procurement is in DG Environment, so they just focus on green. The Commission are going to be producing a new guide about updating the buying social probably next year. But it is also an issue for procurement that the environment side is a bit easier. The green side is easier than the social side because of the legal aspects, particularly when you're verifying, which was your second question. With the labels, there shouldn't be an issue now in asking for labels. That was clarified to a certain extent. You can ask for labels. Verifying, I mean, they've made it more complicated using labels now with the new directives because you have to know what's in that label pretty much, and that's not what we wanted when they were changing the directives, because labels are supposed to be there to make it easier for a procurer, not harder. So that's an issue, but you can ask for labels now or equivalent, and of course you still have to give a supplier a certain amount of time to apply for the label or to prove they got the equivalent if they can't get the label in time. And there was no date set, there was no time set about how you could do that under the directives. That's also an issue. The verification, that is an issue, but most of the green products, the criteria that the European Commission developed is core and comprehensive criteria. The majority of the core criteria should be verifiable. That's why they're in there. And that's for the top 20% of products and services on the market. And we've worked with the Commission on the food one, particularly because we've actually done several projects and they built a lot of what they did on what we did. So I know that most of that it should be easy. You should be able to take the criteria, put it in, and there are ways to verify it. For the comprehensive ones, that's more difficult because it's for more the advanced cities that want to go further than the top 20%. And in Europe, there are quite a few public authorities that want to go further. That's where you need more effort to verify. I'd have to see what particular case that you're referring to, but verification is an issue for many products and service groups, not just food. How do you verify child labour, for example, or if a supplier is saying we're not using child labour, how do you verify it? It's a big issue. We've actually done some work on that and we've developed some models about how you can do that. But there are still some legal issues around the verification, particularly outside of Europe. If you're doing fair trade, yeah. Well, not just fair trade. Actually, anything that's coming outside of Europe is very difficult to verify. But there are ways of doing it, but it requires some work.
Thank you very much. Ari, yeah.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. I would like to also congratulate you both for the wonderful work that you personally do and also your organization do in this area, both in terms of raising awareness and trying to build networks, because the only way that this could work is through creating networks with various stakeholders and various expertise that come together. My question is a general question to both panelists, is based on your experience, whether you see that it is easier or it has been more actively adopted policies that they are linked more to the environmental side of sustainability as opposed to the social side of sustainability, or and the second level is, or whether you have seen in your experience that in order to achieve perhaps some more difficult challenges that social sustainable procurement involves, the environmental aspect has been used as the proxy of trying to, not in a surreptitious way, but in a sort of indirect way, bring in social aspects through the more legit or kosher, if I can use the terminology, environmental aspect, which is less controversial. And whether you think that the European Commission has been supportive enough along the lines that you would like to see the SDGs being, the European Union more general, not the European Commission, has been supportive in this or not? Thank you.
Okay, for the first one, it depends on what level you're talking about with regard to policies. I think your question was, has it been more focused on green than social, yeah? And at the national level, yeah, because it has been more green, I think, at the national level. Looking at, and actually, I did say a statement earlier that there isn't many mandatory requirements for GPP and SPP. It's actually not true. There are about 4 or 5 countries in Europe that do have mandatory requirements. Italy, for one, for example, you have to purchase GPP, UK, and the Netherlands. So there are some examples of that, just to correct myself. But at the national level, yes, there's more of a focus on environment, partly because it's easier to verify, particularly looking at energy efficiency products. You can monetize CO2, the greenhouse gases. So there's been a bit more of a focus on that because it is easier to calculate maybe the life cycle costing and the externalities. On the social side, I mean, you probably know this quite well, it's very difficult to do the externalities on the social. I mean, how do you measure health, for example, the impacts on health on people who are on the production lines? It's very difficult to measure, and that's why at the EU level, you asked the question about have they done enough. I mean, it's difficult to answer that a yes or no. I mean, you could say no, they haven't done enough because there's still some issues that are not being clarified and they've not addressed it, but they can't address it because how do you verify it? So they've got a big issue to deal with. They didn't. I used to sit on the Commission's Public Procurement Expert Group, and we asked this question, you know, why didn't they put it in? Because they felt it was better not to put it in, because if they put wording in, that would create more confusion and probably put people off from doing it. So the directives in the EU are set up in such a way, I think, it's the less wording there is, the more opportunity there is to do something. Whether that comes across for public procurers, I don't know. At the local level, actually I'd say, and particularly in developing countries, it's more of an issue about social. Particularly in Africa, in South America, they want to work with local businesses, they want to work with women, as we saw earlier. They want to support ethnic minority groups in that sense. So the social has come up. And also more so in Europe now for politicians. In Germany, for example, it was a big issue about using paving for market squares. They were using a stone that came from child labour, and that made a big issue. So politicians, of course, are quite interested in avoiding that type of publicity in the press. So social issue is quite, and they also want to use SMEs, they want to use local producers, which has got both an environment and a social aspect.
Thank you. Gustavo? Ah, sorry. Yes.
It's all right. Yeah, since the question was for both.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Aris, for this question. I think that historically, sustainable procurement started with the social aspect. You know, we know that. But then social, it's complex. You know, you have 7 categories, as you know. So it started, of course, by making sure that companies would pay benefits, that they would, of course, provide holidays, working hours, etc. So this is the basis is still there. And even in developing countries, you know, they still use public procurement to ensure that companies, you know, are taking care of their obligations, their social obligations. So this is a reality. Now it's true that, and the study shows it, is that now contracting authorities are more pursuing environmental aspects in sustainable procurement. However, I think in many member states in Europe, for example, they are leading, and the social concerns is really rising. You take France, for example, that doesn't advertise a lot its sustainable procurement. They do a lot of work to, for example, provide set-asides for disadvantaged groups. So they have a very advanced and very really kind of determined and dedicated sustainable procurement, targeting the social aspect. But this is not known. Now in developing countries, there's the issue of the fact that sustainable procurement is not yet, formal policy tool that is adopted, that is in place. And we have the situation where, for example, when we help governments, the ministries of social affairs don't even attend our meetings. So they don't perceive this really as a tool that can help promote their own policies. So that's an issue, that we're facing. Now, in terms of our study and what came out as the fields of social policies that were prioritized, we found out that compared to 2013, diversity and equality ranked first now in terms of social aspects. So this is interesting because this is in line with the discussion we had this morning. So contracting authorities are trying now to use procurement really to promote the diversity and equality policies. Then you had micro and small enterprises, something that has always existed. USA had the Small Business Act, and it has a procurement part to it to support SMEs. Then you had local, in terms of occupational health and safety, workers' rights, fair or ethical trade, is now 32%, human rights, local content, local producers, human trafficking is 20%, and then we have the other social aspects. So it will be interesting to see how this criteria evolve over time, but it's good we have already a baseline now, to assess the interest. Thank you.
Thank you. Gustavo? Sorry, okay.
Sorry. So Louise Thin from EcoVadis. I had a question for Mark Hidson. You were mentioning mandatory sustainable public procurement within European countries, and I was just curious, what does that mean? How does that translate into the legal framework, and how does that translate into actual practice?
That's a good question. In the EU and different member states, there's different ways they've tried to institutionalize it. So, for example, there are certain ones that have made it mandatory from a legislation perspective. Say, for example, you have to purchase products or services using minimum criteria, or using, in the UK, for example, looking at the quick wins, they call them. In Italy, they've got criteria which you're supposed to purchase. The Netherlands also had a target to say that all national governments, this was a few years ago, all national governments should purchase 100% green, I think originally green, and it changed to sustainable public procurement, and then that also was at the local government level. They said that you should purchase that. What that meant and how you measured it was very difficult to do, so they're actually reviewing that. So there's legislation in that sense, but it's more, so it's basically from a criteria perspective, or from a you need to purchase 100%. How it relates to the EU directives, well, it's not been an issue as far as I'm aware, but maybe some of the lawyers in the room could maybe respond to that better. I've not heard that's an issue. It's an issue that they haven't, that the countries haven't achieved it. It's difficult to measure, it's difficult to implement, and to monitor. That's the issues that I've seen that the national governments have faced. I mean, it was, just to add, it was put in some of the procurement directives. So in Denmark, for example, they referred to, I think back in 1992 when they updated their procurement law there, and they referred to environmental issues. I can't remember exactly what it was, though. But it's some countries historically have got a reference to it, to take into account environment. But it's what that particularly means is an issue.
Yeah, coming back to the question on how we can support the implementation of SDGs, we have to keep in mind that right now, contracting authorities don't even know, what are the impacts. I mean, they don't fully know what are the impacts on sustainable development or sustainability issues. So that's already a reality. So in our study, we found out that actually 66% of the governments were monitoring their policies, but they were monitoring mainly institutionalization, the process of establishing a policy. Then they were monitoring the procurement activities, and they tried to monitor the outcomes. And when you say outcomes, is the impact of our policies, and this is the hardest. So to establish this link between our policy and the SDGs is even more difficult. First of all, you have to assess the outcomes. When you, through your policies, what is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions? No government can tell you that, it's very hard. Or creation of jobs, green jobs. It's very difficult, Some governments are attempting, but you need to have centralized system. You need to have really compile all the information from all contracting authorities. So this is complex, but it's happening. Slowly we're building these monitoring systems, and we'll be able then to say, how we can contribute to SDGs.
Thank you. Yes.
I have a communication for you, which is the lunch is not going to be ready until 1:15, so we have 6 or 7 minutes for more questions. I had another communication for everyone. A paper has been distributed reminding everybody that the 3rd Global Procurement Conference is going to take place in Frascati, because you wanted that, between the 3rd and 4th of July 2018, and we've asked everybody to leave us with an idea of what topic they would like to be seeing next year debated. And so if you can leave at the entrance this piece of paper when you leave, that would be very, very nice. But I had 2 questions. Can I ask them? The first question is to both of you. I was surprised, but a bit glad, never to see in your slide reference to a word called centralization. So I wanted to know if for you centralization is a necessary tool. I'm thinking right now very much about green procurement more than social clauses. If centralization is a tool that you would recommend to enhance green procurement, I have in mind that obviously you can internalize better the externality by doing one only tender. But I also have in mind the fact that you go away from the community, away from the territory, and its need in terms of ecological protection. So I wanted to know if there's a position, a stand in which you see the issue to be framed in. My second question is related to the fact that this is a global procurement conference, and so globally speaking, when I have to think about green criteria, I also think that in the world, the likelihood of finding a firm that responds to a given set of green criteria is more likely to be a Western firm. So aren't we colonizing a little bit the less developed world by promoting green procurement globally? Or, said in a positive way, what can we do to avoid that green procurement has this not well-liked consequence? Thank you.
Okay, I'll take the second one first. And if I've understood it, that it's more likely that a Western company would be able to respond to a call for a green product or a sustainable product. Yeah, that's one of the issues with many of the developing countries, which is why the question about are they more interested in the social side or not, but they are interested in more social because they want to procure from companies from their country and from disadvantaged groups, for example, or SMEs. And of course, the problem is that maybe they can't then provide the product or service. I mean, in Africa in particular, when we did a project, the key issue was from the politicians is that if they put out a call for tender, it would be a big company that would come in, sell the product or service, and then the money would go out, and that's what they don't want. I've not seen any studies. I think this is probably the case as well, but I've not, because I've just heard it from local governments and national governments, but I've not seen any evidence of that, any reports to back that up, that that's the case. And what I said, I think, to the question earlier was I think that market intelligence, we call it, so that's the pre-procurement phase, is important to look at what's available on the market or not, even if it's in the country or the region. to see whether there really is product or services available. Because then if there isn't, and you want to really procure from your own country, which is possible in those, and in Europe it's different, that you then don't go out for that criteria. You don't say you want that if you know you're not going to get it. But what you do then is do market engagement. And then again, it can be done through the pre-procurement phase or through the procurement phase, is that you go out to companies and say, look, we in the next 2 years want to purchase vehicles that meet this energy efficiency standard. Can you do that? And discuss it with them. Because you tend to get at least to a solution, if it's not the one you exactly wanted, to get to other solutions. And it's more likely to send a signal to the market, look, this is what we want in the future. So in the EU, we encourage some of the cities to put out PINs, prior information notices, to say, look, in the next few years, we're looking at this. You know, to give you a warning that this is the way we want to go for this type of product or service. So then the company has time to react and see, and then they set up dialogues to discuss it or not. And the first one was about the centralization. And this is about whether procurement should be centralized or decentralized. Yeah, again, I've not seen so much evidence here whether one is better than the other. I think my experience of working with some of the cities, like the city of Ghent, for example, in Belgium, is that they wanted centralized procurement because they wanted to use procurement as a strategic, to change the different departments at the top level. So they worked with the mayor, and they're working at the top level, and they're looking at big product and services. So refurbishment, for example, of buildings or building new ones. And that at a central level, I think probably works better because you need to involve different departments. But I've also seen many of the cities we're working with have decentralized procurement, but what they, for example, Barcelona, and what they do there is they set minimum criteria. They made that mandatory back in 2013 for about 6 product groups. They piloted it in 2010. This is for vehicles, greening parks, for example, estates management, for food. Showed that it worked, and then made it mandatory at the whole departmental level, at the whole city level in 2013. But the majority of it's still decentralized as far as I'm aware. So I think both can work.
Yeah, Gustavo, regarding the first question, I think I mentioned that when I talked about the volumes, and we need to bring down the prices of green goods. That's the first point. So governments are using framework agreements to, I think, promote sustainable procurement, because it's easier to introduce sustainability criteria in framework agreements. You have more control, right? So we tend also to advocate, this route. However, they say that the downside is that you concentrate the expertise at the level of at the central level, and the decentralized contracting authorities lose, this opportunity to learn about sustainable procurement. That's the problem. Then you have also a problem on SMEs. That's the main issue. So, for example, in Italy, I know that Consip balances the advantages of using framework agreements versus the risks that they could have on the market. So they use it differently depending on this criterion. So tomorrow, actually, Lydia Caparelli will be explaining this in Paris in a meeting I'm organizing. Regarding developing countries, that's the core of our work, and what we found out is that it's a real issue for really getting the support from developing countries to sustainable purchasing. And we find out that in Asia, for example, the countries that are leading are the ones that have an industrial base. Japan, China, Korea, they're pushing for it now because they know that in the end, most of the goods, will come from their companies. So there's no risk, especially Korea, they want to be a leader in green economy. So they're using it as a strategic instrument to transform market. I would say that the transformation of the market is even a higher objective than the environmental one, in their mind. See? For developing countries, we have issues where in Morocco, for example, we couldn't find sustainable, even after doing market intelligence and prioritization, we couldn't find green goods on the market. So we had to stop the policy for the moment. In some other countries like Latin America, they're resisting eco-labeling, and the industry is resisting because they think it will give it an advantage to foreign producers, you see. So, we have to move really progressively and, convince them that they have to start with some goods and services that, don't produce a negative impact on their productive sector. And this exists, you can work with the agriculture, you can support small-scale producers, for example, or you can have, like in Ecuador, cooperatives of women that provide the canteens, for example, or the cleaning products. They have a law. So there are solutions, that could be put in place and that can address those concerns.
Yeah, I think this is a very valid question in the context of development banks, and that is obviously something that we have been discussing in the past at heads of procurement meetings. And I think if you take the life cycle costing issue, we all very often get accused of promoting lowest cost, so to speak, which at the end of the day we can discuss what that means. But I think at the end of the day it's a very unfair, let's say, argumentation from the general public, because at the end of the day none of our policies are excluding the possibility to use life cycle costing. As a matter of fact, if I look at our policy, we have for 20 years promoted the use of life cycle costing. But the problem is that when you go to our clients, let's say, who are overseen by politicians who obviously A, have a budget constraint, and B, have a very short lifespan in politics. They want to make sure that they can prove that what you buy is lowest cost, because otherwise this horizon of 25 years of life cycle costing is not fitting with the political life cycle. So that's a big problem. And other constraints, like there's no point trying to impose Euro 6 compatibility of bus engines in some of our countries, because the fuel is not good enough to sustain them. So many of these issues which are very important to take into account in a developing context, and that's why I think your point about promoting more Western or developed type of countries' firms is a very potent issue for us. So, I don't know about you, but I'm hungry. And I believe that we have passed when the food is here, yeah? So we now have a break until probably about 2 o'clock. We'll come back here, yeah? Very good. Thank you very much. And I think an applause, exactly. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very good. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.